Many years ago, I came up with a huge decision to make. And I was trying to make my decision based on faith, and it was a massive challenge for me. I graduated from Baylor. I had been youth minister at Wilshire Baptist Church, and I had a wonderful job with a church that did data processing for all churches all over the country. It was a new country, new company. It was the first people who had ever brought data processing to churches. It was run by some great Christian people. I was doing research and development for them, starting new businesses. I had $3 million of their money in the bank at my disposal if I could justify business plans. I was driving a Porsche. I was living in the village. I was having the time of my life. It was great, making good money too. And then First Baptist Church of Longview called and they wanted me to come be their youth minister. I visited with them twice at their request and three more times at mine. It was a tough decision. I was having to give up my known world and live in a really cool life. And I prayed and prayed and prayed. I made lists. I did the Benjamin Franklin thing where you have reasons to go, reasons not to go. And what it came down to was if I could affect the life of one young person for the rest of eternity, I pretty much had to walk away from the money and the lifestyle I was living because that decision had eternal consequences. I felt like it was the biggest sacrifice I had ever made in my life for God. I felt like I would be lost forever. I'd never make it back to the big city. I thought I was going to a strange little town in East Texas. And as it turned out, I thought I was going to have to sell. I thought I'd have to sell my Porsche. Not only was I able to keep it, one of the ladies in the church bought a brand new one and told me I could use it anytime I wanted to. I never thought I'd be able to buy a house. I was able to buy a house. The Lord took abundantly good care of me. That was one of the big lessons looking back on it, that even if things don't make sense, but we believe God, He keeps His promises to us and He rewards us for our faith. I want to talk to you tonight about faith. I want to talk about four questions tonight that you're probably going to need to ask yourself and answer if you walk by faith. Scripture says we walk by faith, not by sight. So are you walking today by faith or by sight? Are you walking by faith spiritually or by sight, the things that you see and you hear and you taste and you're touched with your five senses? We need to ask the question, are we going to do God's will or my will? Are we going to use my mind or the mind of Christ? Are we going to live by the law or by the love? And I think as we work through these, we're going to see how the disciples with Jesus had to learn how to live by faith. They didn't know what they were doing. It was all new to them. They stumbled, they fell, they asked stupid questions. They just didn't get it for a while, but they kept trying. And they came around and finally they started to understand some things. We're going to look at a very familiar story of the disciples and one of the miracles of Jesus. And we're going to look at how the disciples responded to different parts of it. We're going to see these four questions play into their lives. And I think as you understand this, you're going to understand more and more what Galatians 5:6 means. The New International Version is my favorite translation of that. It says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And there you have it. At the end of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul said, now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. The two things that God expects from every Christian is love. Because when you love, if you love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself, you fulfill all of the law and the prophets. So love is an absolute essential for the Christian life. The other one is faith. Hebrews 11:6, it says, and without faith, it is impossible to please God. All those who earnestly seek him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So, how do we have faith? What's faith mean? When I think about faith, the thing that comes to mind that I got from Bill Johnson, he said, faith is believing in the goodness and the nature and the character and the word of God. What you do with that is your faith. How good do you believe God is? Faith is acting upon the goodness of God. I've learned, I've been through a big transition in my life. I grew up with an idea, a feeling that God was like an angry old man in the sky. He was the rule keeper. He was always watching. He was usually seeing us do wrong, and he's usually upset with us. Well, that's not the God I serve today. I see God as absolute pure love and goodness, and he loves us so much that's going to affect our faith greatly. So we go to this story in Mark, the 8th chapter, very familiar story. There are 4,000 people gathered there, and they've been there for 3 days, and the disciples are interacting with Jesus. Now, the first part of this is so important because you're going to see the goodness of God. It said in verse chapter 8 of Mark, in those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called them his disciples and he said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him. Now, this is the juxtaposition of the disciples and of Jesus. Jesus cares about these people. Well, I want to look at something. We're going to jump over for just a minute in John. We're going to see the nature of Jesus. In John, the 5th chapter, verse 19, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. Verse 30, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgments is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So we go back to Mark chapter 8. That's who Jesus is. He only does what he sees the Father doing. I had a massive revelation today, something I'd never seen in all of my 70 years. I've asked the question for a long time, how in the world did Jesus see God? The best thing I could come up with until today was, well, Jesus said, the Father and I are one. Well, if Jesus and the Father are one, and he only did what he saw the Father doing, I'm guessing he had to see himself. And I still believe this. He had to see himself doing these miracles. I think he saw himself walking up to the tomb of Lazarus and saying, Lazarus, come forth. I think he imagined that. I think he saw these things happen. I think when people approached him, he would see himself opening the eyes of the blind, opening the ears of the deaf, helping the lame to walk, doing the miracles. I think he saw himself walking on the water. because he believed he could do it. He saw himself doing it before he took that first step in to do it. And he did it. But it just said in John that he saw everything the Father was doing because the Father showed him. My mother was the talker in my family growing up. She was the one that I had long conversations with. Dad was a man of few words, but Dad would show me how to do things. I always wanted to mow the grass. You know how it is for teenage boys, they want to drive the lawnmower. I just wanted to mow the grass. And he taught me, he showed me how to do it. I was terrible in the beginning, but he kept staying with me and making small adjustments, and he showed me how to do that. Jesus did not come to this earth to act as God. He came to earth to act and show us what a man without sin, who was fully committed to God, could live and what he could do. Faith is about you becoming like Jesus. Faith is about you being so close to God that you can ask him what to do and he will show you. There's often a price to pay. It took me years and years and years to learn to hear God, but he shows up and he answers questions for us if we just have the patience to keep asking and waiting for him and opening our eyes and our ears. You're going to see some of the struggles the disciples had with this. Jesus is very concerned about the crowd. They've made a genuine effort to find him, to seek him out. They've listened to him for 3 days. He does not want them to be hungry. However, the disciples have no idea what to do in this situation. And his disciples answered him in verse 4 of Mark chapter 8. How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Some of you right now are asking God, how can I survive in this desolate place? I don't know what to do. It's desolate. It's horrible. That's what the disciples were thinking. They had no solutions. They knew the problem was big. They didn't know what to do. Watch how Jesus worked with them, how he showed them what he was doing and how he was doing what the Father was doing because he saw him doing it. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. Now, this brings up an issue. Many of us are constantly asking God to do things for us, but we don't recognize that sometimes God would rather do something through us than for us. You see what Jesus did? He took the food, he broke it, he blessed it, but he handed it. He was involved in the process. He handed it to the disciples, and all they knew was that they had a piece of broken bread and broken fish. He shared that with them, but when they acted in faith, now he just handed it to them. It wasn't enough to feed a bunch of people. They still don't know what's going on. But he started by giving it to them. He modeled it for them, and they gave it to somebody. And they tore off another piece. And they probably just kept doing that until all of a sudden all these people were fed. It was supernatural. It was miraculous. They didn't understand, but he let them participate. Are you willing to take that step of faith and participate with God? You know, I think a lot of us pray for our friends, but sometimes God doesn't want us to just pray for our friends. He wants us to get involved. He may want us to take them out for a meal. He may want us to listen to them. He may want us to write a note of encouragement to them. Are you willing to step out and take an action of faith? So we look at this situation. It goes on. It's working. In verse 5, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit on the ground, and he took 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these should be set before them. And they ate, and they were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Do you realize how they started with 7 loaves and they ended up with 7 basketfuls after feeding 4,000 men plus their wives and children? And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got in the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now the scene changes here. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now the disciples are alone with him. They've just seen this astounding miracle. This is what they talk about. Verse 14. Now they had forgotten to bring the bread, and they only had 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact they had no bread. Jesus is talking about leaven. They're thinking, "Oh my gosh, we've only got 1 loaf of bread. What are we going to do? Anybody got more bread? Nope, nobody has any bread. What are we going to do? It's not enough for all of us. We just got 1 loaf of bread." They were about the bread. Jesus was trying to talk to them about something spiritual. And he began discussing with one another the fact they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand?" It's a question for all of us. Do you not yet perceive or understand things about God? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Now, let's talk about this. Jesus is trying to teach them. He's asking questions. It was the Socratic method of teaching. He asked them questions. Do you not see? Do you not hear? Do you not understand? He said, do you not remember? All of us come to those times where we're overwhelmed and we have trouble seeing and hearing Jesus. But we can always remember. Jesus is helping them remember. Anytime you find yourself in a difficult situation and you can't seem to connect with God, you can't seem to get the answers that you're looking for, you can remember. So I would encourage you to remember the times that God came through. The times that it just looked like it was going to be so much trouble. You didn't know if you're going to be able to make it or not, but you made it through. Remember. Because as you start to remember, and this is going to be, it's going to lead you into worship and praise and thanksgiving. And when you remember all of the good things that God has done for you before, time and time again, you start to see and you start to hear more clearly. So we're going to come to those 4 questions we ask. Are you going to walk by sight or by faith? 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, we walk by faith, not by sight. We talked about this to some degree last week. Which are you walking by? What is determining your thoughts and feelings today? Is it faith in God, or is it what you're looking at? Is it the reality? See, one of the things that we need to understand is God comes to us from an eternal perspective. It changes how we live when we remember someday there's going to be accounting to God. We're going to stand before God. We're going to have to count for our lives. If we keep that in mind, it makes this life a whole lot easier. Sometimes we feel like we're going to be miserable. We're going to suffer. We're going to do without for all the rest of our lives. And it feels like a very long time. But when you put this temporary suffering we're going through in light of all eternity, it's gone like that. This will change how you have faith. Remember from Hebrews 11, verse 3, it says that understanding comes from faith. Most of us think, no, we have to understand, then we'll have faith. Mm-mm. Faith brings understanding. As you trust God, your mind clears. Part of this that faith brings understanding is faith when you're thinking and focusing on the goodness of God, the truth of His Word, His character, how faithful He is. When you're focused on that, that's going to bring you peace. In psychology, there's something I've talked to you about many times called the law of the seesaw. On one end, you have clarity of thought. On the other end, you have powerful feelings. When the feelings go up, our clarity of thought goes down. Now, if we start to remember the goodness of God and our faith in Him is what we start thinking about, just how good He is and how He's always taken care of us and how much He has given us as it is right now, so much. That's going to push those negative feelings down, and your own natural clarity of thought begins to return to you. So we have to ask ourselves the question all the time, am I going to live by faith or by sight? I can look around and everything around me is crumbling. I can look to God, everything is possible. And we've got a whole thick Bible about that thick that's constantly talking about how in impossible situations for man, God came through and brought good things out of any and all kinds of situations. That's what God does. That's what a life of faith is about. And this is why faith is so important to help you stay positive, to help you stay in love and joy and peace and gratitude. It's constantly taking our eyes off of the many things that are wrong, that are undone, that are in trouble around us, and looking back to God. We walk by faith and not by sight. The disciples looked at the situation with 4,000 men and their families and no food, no convenience stores, no money, no possible way to feed all these people. They were walking by sight. Jesus was walking by faith. He said, what you got? 7 loaves, 2 fishes? Bring them to me. It's amazing how many times God will say to you, what do you have? And when you bring what you have to the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings and put it in His hands, He starts to multiply. There have been many times I did not have enough money to make it. There was one year I paid tax on $2,200. It was a long time ago. It was a bad year. Just was without work and couldn't make money. $2,200. That's not enough to live on. I took a job. I lost the job. I went to San Diego for 6 weeks. Only time I was ever fired in my life. Realized I gotten ripped off. They would hire people to develop territories for them, and then they cut them loose. I wasn't the only one. So that was just a loss. Took me a while to get another job. Just did not have enough money, but God sustained me with only making $2,200 a year and only having just a little bit less to pay the month's bills for the next 10 or 11 months. I still made it. It defies arithmetic. It defies mathematics. And in addition to that, I had a free trip to Russia and Kazakhstan for 3 weeks. Somebody gave me enough money to buy a new car. It was not a bad year at all. It was a good year, but financially, it was absolutely impossible, and God navigated me through it. So it's so important to ask yourself, do you want to live by faith or by sight? Next question, are you going to depend on your mind? And some of you guys are really bright, bright, bright people, but you're human. Do you want to depend on your mind or the mind of Christ? We talked about this last week in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. This is how you get to the mind of Christ. You have to renew your minds. Romans 12, 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, which is your spiritual act of service. And remember, we talked about if you expect God to be your servant, you're going to be disappointed and frustrated all the time. If you choose to be God's servant, you will find yourself awed and amazed all the time. This is tough stuff to figure out. We look at this, the next verse, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I really like the New International Version's translation, good, pleasing, and perfect. So as you renew your mind and renew your mind and renew your mind, that's how you develop the mind of Christ. And you start to see things from God's perspective. See, this is our story in Mark 8 tonight. The disciples were walking by sight. They didn't see a way. Jesus was walking by faith. They said, bring me what you got. He'd seen God because God had shown him how to do that. So he broke the bread, he tore the fish, he handed it to the disciples, and he watched the miraculous happen. Well, Christ always had the mind of Christ. You can develop that. The way you do it is constantly renewing your mind. That leads us to the next question you need to ask yourself. Am I going to do my will or his will? Now, I just want to put something in perspective and appeal to your intellect here. Look at all the things and the trouble and the heartache that your will has gotten you to in your life. There are many times I knew the difference between my will and God's will, and I went my own direction. It usually did not work out very well. Nearly always did not work out very well. But you look at God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Please let me define that to you. His will for you, the things God would have you do, is always going to be good. That's the bottom. It's going to be better than that. It's going to be pleasing, acceptable. I like pleasing better. I think that's a better translation of what God intends. If you're pleased with something, that means you're going to like it. If you're pleased, it's going to be satisfying. It's going to be fulfilling. So it's good, it's pleasing, and his will is perfect. By definition, if it's perfect, it cannot be improved upon. But how many times has our will been imperfect? So when you renew your mind, that's going to help you have the mind of Christ, and that's going to help you do God's will. God's will is the best for you. This is hard to believe. It takes a lot of years to grow into this and test it. And I've tested just about everything God has ever said, but His will is best for us. And I want God's will. That's why it gets easier and easier and easier to obey Him, to do what He's leading me to do. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense at all. But when we renew our minds, and we don't be conformed to the pattern of this world anymore, and we don't walk by sight, we walk by faith instead. We renew our minds, we get the mind of Christ, then we can choose God's will over our will. Now, God's will disrupt. We talked about this some last week. God causes all things to work together for the good to those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. There's often a conflict between the purposes of God and the plans and the passions and the preferences of human beings. So if you can align your plans, your preferences, and your passions with what God would have you do, that's when He's going to make everything in your life start snapping together. I learned this the hard way. For 7 years of my life, I begged and I pleaded and said, God, I'll never, ever be happy unless you let me go back to local church ministry. I just wanted to be back on a church staff again. And I begged and pleaded with God. And He just about had to break my knuckles to get me to let go of that idea. And then one day we were talking and I started thinking, and God started telling me what to do. And He was trying for 7 years, and I just would not have eyes to see or ears to hear. But He'd been trying to tell me and show me, start your own ministry. I had 1,000 reasons not to do that. He says, hey, start your own ministry. And my question to Him was like, well, God, is money just going to show up on my doorstep? And He told me two things that were very clear. He said, don't ask anybody for money. Don't raise funds for your new ministry. Trust me. Have faith in me. I will provide for you. Don't ask people for money and don't advertise. Oh, great, God. So people are just going to show up at my doorstep. Well, with the wise counsel of some of my leaders and my mentors and my pastors, I decided to do it. Well, I didn't realize how much better than being on a local church staff that was going to be. So when I started my own ministry, all of a sudden, I didn't have to work weekends unless I wanted to. I didn't have to work evenings unless I wanted to. I could call my own shots. And I ended up going from in a local church. I love to counsel and I like to teach. Those are the things I like to do the most. In a local church, I could probably spend 30 or 40% of my time doing that. And then a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't especially want to do. When I started my own ministry, 95% of my time was devoted totally to my two favorite things to do. I finally stepped into God's will out of my own that I want to go back to the local church staff to having my own ministry. And He's blessed me more than I could ask or imagine. He's taken such good care. One day I was just griping about, well, I don't have the perks. I don't have the 401k that I had with the churches. I don't get a Christmas bonus every year. I don't get paid vacation all the time. If I don't work, I don't make any money. Blah, blah, blah. Went on and on and on. And He said, do you really think I don't have a package for you? Do you think I don't have benefits for you? And He has taken such good care of me. So this is why I'm trying to convince you that our will at best is going to be our will. We have access to the will of God. What was his will? Jesus said, when you pray, pray this way, saying, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's God's will. That's what he's trying to bring about, is that earth will become more and more like heaven. That's what he wants for your life. He wants your life to be his will, which is more like heaven than earth. And he's trying to bless you greatly with this as you move toward this. He wants it to work out good for you. That last question that we're going to look at is, are you going to live by love or law? We're back to Mark chapter 8. That's when the Pharisees came along. This is when Jesus started talking to these guys about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they're thinking, they're talking about bread. They missed it. This is when he asked them the question, do you not see? Do you not hear? Do you not perceive? Do you not understand? Do you still not get it yet? Well, what he was saying is the Pharisees are the ones that heap heavy loads on you. They're self-righteous, they're legalistic, they're judgmental, and they have missed me totally and completely. They have made the Christian life, or the Jewish life, as the Pharisees were, about the law rather than the love of God. And this is something I care so much about Christians in church, that they're missing it, like the disciples did, like the Pharisees did. You know, so many people are constantly getting in the Word of God, but they don't have the Word in them. And so many people, like the Pharisees, didn't accept Jesus because he was the Word. They had been in the Word of God. They had memorized most of the Old Testament. They were phenomenal at knowing the Word of God, but they missed God. That's what happens to us if we're more concerned about the law, about keeping the rules and the regulations. It becomes more about the law than the love of God. It becomes more about the rules and regulations than the relationship with God. It's really all about Jesus. Get into the Word. And Jesus is the Word. In John, he said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the Word. Get into him and get him into you. And it's like John said, I must decrease, he must increase. As you give him more control, you're going to be walking by faith. You're going to be having the mind of Christ. You're going to be choosing God's will over your will. And you're going to be walking in love rather than legalism in the law. That's the questions we have to ask. How am I living? Am I just trying to keep the rules, or am I trying to have a love relationship with God? Makes all the difference. I'll wrap it up with this. Years ago, I was in a men's Bible study group. In fact, it's the one this year we started our 24th year. Robbie Briggs, who many of you probably know or know of, he used to own Briggs Freeman Real Estate. Robbie was a good businessman. His dad had started Briggs Freeman. Robbie took it over. Then he bought out his partner, Mr. Freeman, kept the name, but bought out his partner, took full control. Was rocking along, was just having a great time in real estate. Was probably the biggest and the best boutique type of dealership in the Highland Park area, really killing it. He ultimately merged with Sotheby's in Dallas and Fort Worth. He grew this huge empire in real estate, but God called him to move to China. And he didn't know why. But Robbie was living in probably the most peaceful home I've ever been in. It was 10 minutes from downtown Dallas, but it was around a lake. There were about 20 houses around this lake. It was a ranch style home. It was gorgeous on the inside. You step out on the back patio and you look over the infinity pool to the lake below it. He always had really good taste in homes. His wife loved that house more than anywhere they'd ever lived before. But God called them to move to China. Didn't know why. So he ran the business the best he could from China. But he moved to China and he was there for several years. That is faith. Well, there were some rough times in some negotiations with Sotheby's, but eventually he got them all worked out. He took the company to the highest, most profitable it ever been, and he sold out a couple of years ago. And he came out really well. He was the kind of guy, though, that if God said, do something, he didn't have to understand. He just needed to know, Lord, what do I do next? And God told him, move to China. He did. God told him to move back, picked up the company, doubled, tripled, quadrupled it. Then he sold it. God wants to lead you like that. I'd be surprised if anybody on the Zoom call will have to go to China, but he's got something for each one of you to do by faith. It oftentimes will not make sense, but this is where your relationship with God will show forth. If you know him, if you hear him, his sheep recognize his voice. And he's going to teach you to live by faith. He's going to teach you to have the mind of Christ. He's going to teach you how to know the will of God. And he's going to cause everything when you're doing God's will. That means you're called according to his purposes. And that's why he's going to step up and cause everything in your life to work together for your good. It's scary. It's challenging. But I guarantee you would bet my life on it. It's well worth it to live the life of faith. Because the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love.